everyone, and welcome to the Sound Mind podcast, where we dive into the fascinating world of music psychology. I'm your host, Sophia, and as a music psychologist, I'll be guiding you through everything you've ever wondered about music. So, whether you're a music lover or are just interested in the science of sound, you're in the right place, so stick around. So, I wanted to do a Halloween episode. Yes, I know it's technically been almost 2 weeks since Halloween now, but I love Halloween, and I also refuse to get into the Christmas spirit yet, so we're going for it. The leaves are still orange, which means we can still be in the autumn vibe. Today, I want to talk about horror movies and scary music. Now, have you ever heard a piece of music that made your heart race, even though nothing scary was on the screen yet? That's not an accident. In today's episode, I want to unpack the psychology of scary music and why certain sounds seem to crawl right under our skin. So, when you think of fear, you probably imagine something you can see, like a shadow moving in the dark, a hand on your shoulder, the flicker of something. But long before we had sight as our main sense of safety, we actually had sound. Our brains are hardwired to treat certain sounds as warning signs. Long before we had words, we had instinct, and instinct listens. So from an evolutionary standpoint, sound is actually one of the body's earliest alarm systems. Unlike sight, which depends on where you're facing, hearing surrounds us. You can close your eyes, but you can't close your ears. So for our ancestors on the savannah, hearing was often the first and the only cue that something dangerous was nearby. Think about a sudden rustle in the grass, a snap of a twig, a growl in the distance. When something roared behind you, there was no time to analyze, only to react. And those who hesitated didn't pass on their genes. So the human brain evolved to privilege speed over certainty when it comes to sound. We respond first and think later. And that's why even today, certain kinds of sounds instantly hijack our nervous system. They grab our attention, accelerate our heartbeat, and trigger this ancient fight or flight reflex that we have, often even before we're aware of it. But two types of sounds are especially potent. You've got high-pitched screeches and low-frequency rumbles. So high-pitched sounds, imagine like a baby crying or an animal in distress. They're packed with roughness, a kind of jagged irregularity in their frequency. So research has actually discovered that human screams share a specific roughness in the 30 to 150 hertz modulation range. And this acoustic texture is actually what makes them so gripping. In these experiments that were done, these rough sounds activated the amygdala, which is the brain's emotional center. And this was done far more strongly than normal speech or just music in general. So in essence, our brains treat screams as biological alarms, which is like this sonic flare for danger that's literally impossible to ignore. So the composer for Alfred Hitchcock, Bernard Herrmann, it's the same principle that he harnessed in the Psycho shower scene. Those shrieking violins don't just accompany the violence, they literally embody it. They mimic this kind of raw, non-linear frequency of a human scream. And even without visuals, that sound alone can make your body seize up. Your heart rate goes up, your palms are sweating, and your muscles brace. And that response isn't cinematic conditioning, it's evolution. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, low-frequency rumbles tap into a different kind of primal fear. These deep, vibrating sounds like thunder, earthquakes, and growls have always signaled one thing: something big is coming. For our ancestors, those low sounds often meant a predator nearby or the earth itself was in motion. And the body learned to associate them with threat and magnitude. And even in modern settings, these sub-bass frequencies still trigger anxiety. One study, which was done by Daniel Blumstein, who's a biologist who studies animal alarm calls, so he analysed hundreds of film soundtracks and found that the most unsettling ones often contain these non-linear acoustic features like sudden pitch jumps, distortion, or irregular vibrations, the same acoustic cues that animals use to signal distress. Essentially, our brains can't distinguish between a lion's roar and a distorted cello. Both sound like danger. And horror composers have long understood this, consciously or not. They design these soundscapes that are biologically unsettling, sounds that make your nervous system twitch before your conscious mind even registers why. So take infrasound, for instance. These are frequencies that are below 20 hertz, technically below the range of human hearing. You don't hear it, but you feel it. It's like a faint pressure in your chest or the tightening of your gut. And one study actually tested this by inserting infrasound into live concert performances. The audience didn't know which pieces contained it, but those who heard the low-frequency mix reported higher levels of unease, sorrow, fear, and even chills, all without realizing why. I think this is so fascinating. It's actually something that I found out about more recently. I read an article about some horror movies using infrasound, and I wasn't really sure if it was confirmed or not, so don't take my word for that 100%. There are a few articles on it out there. I think it's largely speculation, but even if it's not used in certain horror movies, it exists, and it's pretty fascinating. But I think that's what makes fear in sound so intriguing overall. It's precognitive. These reactions occur milliseconds before we have a conscious thought. The amygdala processes potential threats faster than the cortex can rationalize them. And that's why even lifelong horror fans who know that the jump scare is coming still flinch when strings start to shriek or a bass is rumbling. Your body reacts first and your brain is just playing catch up. And composers exploit this beautifully by walking this line between the familiar and the uncanny. So think a child's lullaby played slightly off key, a soft hum that kind of warps into static. These aren't just clever production tricks, they're literally manipulations of these deep, ancient instincts that we have, and each one taps into this evolutionary wiring that once kept us alive, and now it's keeping us on edge. So when a soundtrack makes you feel uneasy before anything actually scary happens on screen, just remember that's your biology reacting. You're not just hearing the music, you're feeling this echo of human survival, which is pretty cool when you look at it that way, and it might help you sleep better at night. So once we understand how certain sounds instinctively grab our attention, the next question is, how do composers build fear from those ingredients? What separates a slightly eerie melody from one that literally makes your skin crawl? So in horror soundtracks, it's actually rarely about melody or harmony in the traditional sense. It's all about tension, uncertainty, and control. Composers use a toolkit of techniques designed to manipulate your expectations, hijack emotional responses, and blur the line between what feels musical and what kind of feels alive, I guess. So let's break down some of the most powerful musical tools in that toolkit. Starting off with dissonance. So if consonance is musical comfort, so notes that blend smoothly, dissonance is its dark twin, clashing intervals that are fighting for resolution. So when two notes are close together, technically like a minor second interval, their sound waves interfere with each other and they produce this kind of pulsing, beating effect. And the brain registers this instability as tension. It wants resolution, but in horror music, that resolution never comes. One of the most infamous intervals in Western music is the tritoned, which was historically nicknamed diabolus in musica, or the devil's interval. And in medieval times, it was actually avoided in church music for its dissonant, unsettling quality. But in modern soundtracks, it's a staple of suspense. From The Exorcist to The Shining, composers use the tritone to create unease that feels ancient, almost kind of taboo. It's kind of exciting. And neuroscientific research actually supports this as well. So studies using fMRI imaging show that dissonant chords activate regions of the brain linked to conflict detection and emotional discomfort. In other words, our brains literally process dissonance as tension that needs to be resolved. But in horror, the tension stays. And that unresolved dissonance becomes the soundtrack of anxiety itself. Now, the next one is silence. Sometimes the scariest sound is the absence of sound. Horror composers use silence the way that directors use darkness, to heighten anticipation. So a sudden drop in volume, a held breath, it creates what psychologists call expectation violation. The brain predicts an event, doesn't get it, and amplifies its vigilance. And this plays on a core cognitive mechanism. We're prediction machines. The auditory cortex is constantly anticipating what's coming next based on rhythm, pattern, and context. And when a film's score suddenly cuts to silence, the brain is left hanging, searching for resolution. And the longer that silence lingers, the stronger the anticipation, and the more powerful the scare when the sound finally returns. Filmmakers like Ari Aster, who did Hereditary and Midsommar, and Robert Eggers, who did The Witch, are quite literally masters of this. Their soundtracks often use this dynamic contrast, so you've got these whisper, quiet ambience punctuated by explosive noise, and that's just to keep the viewers on edge. It's not actually just about loudness, it's all about that manipulation of expectation. And then we've got rhythm. So in most music, rhythm creates safety. We tap along to beats because they're predictable, right? They sort of orient us in time. But horror movie composers subvert that sense of stability. By using irregular time signatures, syncopation, or abrupt tempo shifts, they prevent the listener from finding a steady pulse, and our brains literally hate that. Research in cognitive neuroscience shows that rhythm predictability helps regulate physiological states like breathing and heart rate, but disrupting it does the opposite. It increases alertness, anxiety, and cortisol release, which is a stress hormone. And when we can't predict what's next, our whole body is ready to react. But not all horror relies on chaos. Sometimes repetition, when it's paired with subtle variation, becomes its own form of torture. So take the Jaws theme. It's 2 notes, E and F, repeated endlessly. It's simple, almost boring, but because it's so repetitive, it becomes inescapable. The mind is constantly anticipating the next attack with every iteration. And this is the paradox of horror repetition. Predictability doesn't always soothe us. Sometimes it traps us. When a musical phrase loops with minor changes, maybe you've got a note that's slightly detuned or a rhythm that's slightly delayed, it creates what psychologists call habituation violation. You get used to the pattern, and then the pattern betrays you. Repetition also mimics the experience of obsession and anxiety, thoughts looping without resolution. And that's why minimalist techniques like those used by composer Krzysztof Penderecki are so powerful in films like The Shining. They mirror the sound of a mind unraveling. It's actually quite amazing when you think about it. It's like a descent into madness. And the last one I want to talk about here is this kind of sound design crossover. So, modern horror has really blurred the boundaries between score and sound design. Instead of traditional orchestration, composers often use ambient noise, whispers, reversed instruments, and field recordings to create textures that feel too real to be music, yet too musical to be noise. And the late composer Krzysztof Penderecki pioneered this in the 1960s with these dense clutters of strings and microtonal slides that literally sounded like swarms of insects. And his work later became synonymous with psychological horror, thanks to Kubrick's The Shining, like I mentioned. And today, artists like Ben Frost, Micah Levi, and Colin Stetson take this further, using breath, static, metal scrapes, and reverse tones to create soundscapes that feel physical, almost tactile. And from a psychological standpoint, these sounds trigger discomfort because they sit in this uncanny valley of hearing. They sound human, but not quite. It's like a whisper that's too close, a violin that breathes. And in studies on auditory perception, ambiguous sounds, so those that don't kind of fit neatly into familiar categories, they increase activity in the brain's anterior insula and the superior temporal gyrus, which are both linked to uncertainty and vigilance. In other words, when we can't tell whether a sound is musical or natural, our brains stay alert, and horror composers weaponize that ambiguity. Now, there's something beautifully paradoxical about fear. We spend much of our lives trying to avoid it, yet we willingly seek it out in films, haunted houses, and chilling soundtracks. The psychology behind why we enjoy being scared comes down to one crucial distinction: safe fear. When we experience fear in a controlled setting, like listening to unsettling music or watching a horror film on our couch at home, our brains activate the same physiological responses as if we were truly in danger. The racing heartbeat, the adrenaline rush, the tightening in the chest. But crucially, our cognitive brain knows that we're safe. And this creates what researchers call a controlled adrenaline state. It's like a chemical cocktail of excitement, focus, and alertness without real danger. So one neuroscientist called Margie Kerr, who studies fear at the University of Pittsburgh, she described this as a biological thrill ride. We kind of get to flirt with danger and experience the high of survival, all from the safety of our sofa or cinema seat. It's a simulation of threat, and surviving it actually brings us pleasure. But what's fascinating is that fear, when framed safely, triggers the same reward systems that make us feel excitement and joy. Functional MRI studies have shown that the amygdala doesn't just process negative emotion. When activated in a non-threatening context, it communicates with the nucleus accumbens, which is a region tied to dopamine release and pleasure. So essentially, when we know that we're safe, fear becomes exhilarating instead of paralyzing. And that's why the line between fear and fun can feel so thin. Both involve this heightened sense of arousal, adrenaline, and anticipation. As Kerr puts it, fear and excitement are two sides of the same physiological coin. And from a psychological standpoint, this is what makes fear such a powerful tool for emotional regulation as well. When we voluntarily expose ourselves to fear, whether that's through horror music or roller coasters or jump scares, we're essentially practicing how to manage anxiety in a controlled setting. It's like emotional strength training. So one study explored this concept of recreational fear by studying visitors at a haunted house attraction. And the researchers found that those who self-reported moderate fear levels left the experience with improved mood and reduced stress, while those who felt too little or actually too much fear also showed no benefit. But the sweet spot they discovered was balance. Just enough fear to activate the stress response, but not so much that it overwhelmed the sense of safety. And this balance allows the body to rehearse emotional recovery, strengthening our ability to regulate anxiety in real life, which is pretty cool, to be honest. And music is uniquely positioned to offer this kind of emotional rehearsal because it doesn't need visual cues to evoke emotion. It creates emotion through sound alone. And psychologists refer to this as emotional simulation. So when we listen to scary music, our brains don't passively hear danger, they simulate it. Studies using physiological measures like heart rate and skin response have shown that even abstract, dissonant music can cause the same autonomic arousal as real-world threats. The body tenses, the heart quickens, and the skin conducts more electricity, all signs of emotional activation. Yet because we know the sound is fictional or aesthetic, we're able to ride that wave of fear without losing control. The process mirrors what happens when people listen to sad music. We experience the emotion, but with psychological distance. But in both cases, the emotion becomes art, a safe vessel for something powerful and primal. And this emotional simulation actually explains why so many people describe horror scores or eerie soundtracks as cathartic, actually. There's a kind of cleansing that comes from confronting fear in a safe way. There was actually a cool study that found that horror fans often have a better emotional recovery after startling experiences. Their bodies return to baseline faster than non-horror fans, suggesting that they might be better at regulating physiological arousal. It's not that they don't feel fear, it's that they've kind of learned how to ride it. And personality research supports this too, which is always really interesting. So people who enjoy horror, unsettling soundscapes, or extreme emotional experiences often score higher on sensation-seeking traits, which is a term coined by psychologist Marvin Zuckerman to describe those who crave novelty, intensity, and more complex stimulation. And for these individuals, fear-based experiences provide the perfect mix of arousal and safety. But it's not just about thrill-seeking, it's also about this sense of emotional mastery. When these individuals face fear, even simulated fear, their nervous systems recover more quickly and they often report a stronger sense of satisfaction or euphoria afterward. And this rapid emotional rebound explains why that eerie music build-up followed by sudden silence or resolution feels so addictive. The body moves fluidly from tension to relief, creating this kind of powerful emotional release. So at its core, our attraction to scary music reveals something profound about human psychology. We don't just seek pleasure, we seek intensity. Fear allows us to feel alive, to test our limits, and to engage parts of the brain that everyday life honestly rarely touches. Scary music in particular offers a way to access that intensity through abstraction, without blood, danger, or real-world risk. It turns fear into play and anxiety into a kind of art. And when the final note fades and the lights come back on, what's left lingering isn't dread, it's relief, exhilaration, and this subtle sense that maybe we learned something about ourselves. And in that sense, music doesn't just soundtrack fear, it actually transforms it into something so deeply human. This kind of rehearsal for danger that kind of reminds us that, yeah, you survived that and you're awesome for that. And that makes us feel great about ourselves. Now, I want to finish up by talking about how the sound of fear has actually evolved dramatically over the past century. I think it reflects not just changes in musical technology, but deeper shifts in how we experience suspense, anxiety, and anticipation as well. So, in the early days of horror cinema, fear was loud, orchestral, and unmistakable. Composers like Bernard Herrmann, who I mentioned earlier, turned dissonance into an art form, using the orchestra as a weapon. His Psycho score is perhaps the best example of the series approach. Those shrieking, stabbing violin notes are still instantly recognizable more than 60 years later. But what made it so effective was how it mimicked biological alarm calls, short, sharp bursts that trigger instinctive panic. And Herman understood that sometimes the most terrifying sound isn't elaborate harmony, but raw texture. He stripped the orchestra of warmth, so no low instruments, no lush chords, and instead he focused on the piercing upper strings that resemble that human scream that I mentioned earlier. The result wasn't just music for the scene, it literally became the scene. It's like a sonic embodiment of the horror itself. But as horror filmmaking evolved, so did its soundscape. So by the late 1970s and 80s, composers began moving away from these grand orchestral traditions towards something colder and leaner, I guess a little bit eerier as well. This was the rise of synthesized horror. So John Carpenter, who both directed and composed for films like Halloween and The Fog, revolutionized how fear could sound. His music was minimalist and relentless. Think repetitive piano motifs over pulsing electronic bass lines, creating this sense of inevitability rather than surprise. So the Halloween theme, it's got a steady 5/4 rhythm. It feels quite mechanical, almost predatory, almost like the footsteps of Michael Myers himself. And this was a new kind of fear, not chaotic and explosive, but clinical, inescapable. The synthesizer gave horror this industrial, kind of alien quality. It wasn't just human screams or violins anymore, but the hum of machines. And the influence of Carpenter's synth-based approach actually continues today, not only in horror, but actually across pop culture. The creators of Stranger Things actually intentionally drew from Carpenter's sonic palette, using these kind of retro analog synths to create a sense of both nostalgia and dread. I think it's a fascinating psychological blend. It's like comfort and terror intertwined with each other. And we recognize the 80s sound as familiar, yet the way that it's presented makes it feel uncanny. And similarly, films like It Follows use electronic minimalism to capture this modern kind of fear, one that's less about sudden jumps and more about slow, creeping unease. These soundtracks often rely on drones, distortion, and repetition rather than melody, forcing the listener into this state of suspended tension. But meanwhile, the boundary between music and sound design has become increasingly porous. Modern horror composers often collaborate closely with sound engineers to actually craft these immersive soundscapes that blur the line between score and diegetic noise. So in films like The Witch, Hereditary, or even the Blair Witch Project, it's often hard to tell what counts as music. You might hear an indistinct hum, a low vibration, or a kind of breathy texture that could easily just be part of the environment. And this ambiguity is psychologically disorienting because it kind of strips the listener of orientation. We no longer know where the sound is coming from, or whether it belongs to the world of the story, and that confusion deepens our fear. And then moving on to the realm of video games. So this blending of music and sound design has really evolved into something truly dynamic. Something called adaptive audio, which is sound that changes in real time based on the player's action, has really transformed how we experience horror. So games like Resident Evil, Dead Space, and Silent Hill, they don't just accompany fear, they literally respond to it. When a player hesitates or lingers too long in one area, the score might swell in this kind of dissonant tension. If they flee, the tempo quickens, which actually matches their heartbeat. And some experimental systems even use biometric data, tracking heart rate or breathing, to modulate sound intensity, creating this loop of physiological feedback. In this sense, the soundtrack becomes alive, mirroring your body's own fear response, which is crazy and really just fully immerses you. This isn't just storytelling, it's embodied horror, where the sound adapts to your emotional state. Yet in the midst of all of this technological sophistication, some of the most effective modern horror soundtracks actually embrace silence. A24's horror films like The Witch, Hereditary, Midsummer, and The Lighthouse have made the absence of sound one of their most recognizable stylistic traits. Silence magnifies vulnerability. It actually removes the auditory safety net that music often provides, forcing us to confront this raw tension of stillness. When there's no score to guide our emotional response, every creak of a floorboard or distant breath becomes amplified and we overthink everything. And psychologically, silence increases anticipation because it actually denies us of resolution. The brain expects something to happen, and in that waiting, the fear is multiplying. So, taken all together, the evolution of scary music really mirrors the evolution of fear itself, I think. In the 1960s, fear screamed. In the 80s, it kind of pulsed. And today, it whispers, drones, and sometimes disappears altogether. Composers have learned that terror isn't just about volume or chaos. It's all about audience control. You've got to manipulate tension, familiarity, and sensory expectation, and they can play our nervous systems like instruments. I think they're always finding new ways to remind us what it means to listen and to fear. Scary music works because it speaks the oldest emotional language that we know. I think it's pretty awesome. I'm not a massive horror fan. I get way too scared, but I do enjoy a good psychological horror. I loved Midsummer. It's one of my favorites. I think it's totally messed up. But those kind of psychological horrors are the ones that gets me. And yeah, I love anything that kind of thrills. So yeah, not a big fan of the paranormal, but I do love that kind of stuff. And would love to know what all of you enjoy. What are some of your favorite horror movies? Some of your favorite horror movie soundtracks? Come and say hi over on Instagram or on Threads, and yeah, let me know. But that brings us to the end of today's episode. Thank you so much for joining me today on The Sound Mind. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate or review on wherever you're listening and share it with someone who loves music or horror movies just as much as you do, or may just find it interesting. Don't forget to follow us and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. But until next time, keep listening, keep reflecting, and I'll see you on The Sound Mind.